In this episode, we settle into the reality that assessments are not magic, and they are not just a person showing up with a clipboard and good intentions. An assessment is a project, even when it is small, and projects succeed or fail based on how well people agree on what they are trying to accomplish and how they will do it. If you have ever watched a group start a home renovation without deciding what room they are renovating, what the budget is, and who is buying the materials, you already understand the kind of chaos that an unplanned assessment can create. The purpose here is to help you learn how to set clear assessment objectives, define the scope, line up resources, build a realistic schedule, decide what deliverables will be produced, and handle practical logistics that can make or break the entire effort. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC-style in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first idea to lock in is what assessment objectives really are, because the word objective sounds simple and it often gets treated like a slogan instead of a decision. Objectives are the specific outcomes the assessment must achieve, stated in a way that can be verified later. A vague objective like improve security sounds nice, but it does not help anyone decide what evidence to gather or how deep to go. A better objective is something like determining whether required controls are implemented and operating effectively for a defined system boundary, or confirming that a set of requirements is met for a specific authorization decision. Objectives also establish why the assessment is happening now, because timing matters. Some assessments are routine, some are triggered by change, and some are driven by an external obligation. When objectives are clear, they become the anchor that keeps every other planning decision from drifting into unnecessary work or, just as bad, missing critical coverage. Once objectives exist, scope becomes the guardrail, because scope answers the question of what is in and what is out, and it needs to be said plainly. Beginners often think scope is just a list of servers or applications, but scope is broader and more practical than that. Scope includes the system boundary, the types of controls or requirements being assessed, the organizational units involved, and the time period of evidence that will be considered relevant. Scope also includes constraints, like whether production systems can be touched, whether certain tests are prohibited, or whether only specific environments are in play. A common misconception is that a broad scope automatically means a thorough assessment, but broad scope can actually reduce quality if it stretches the team beyond what they can do well. A realistic scope creates a situation where the assessment can actually prove something, rather than generating a long set of guesses. To make scope useful, you have to connect it to what you are assessing against, because assessments do not exist in a vacuum. There is always a set of requirements, standards, policies, contractual clauses, or regulatory expectations that define what good looks like. When people skip this connection, they end up assessing whatever feels important, which is a recipe for conflict later. In a governance, risk, and compliance context, that target might be a control baseline, an internal policy set, a framework mapping, or an agreed requirement list for a given system. This is where you learn to be disciplined about what the assessment will measure, because measurement drives evidence and evidence drives defensible conclusions. If the requirement says a control must exist and be operating, then the scope needs to include both the design of the control and the proof it actually works. When scope and requirements align, the assessment can speak the language decision-makers need. Resources are the next planning pillar, and it helps to think of resources as everything the assessment needs in order to be performed with integrity. People usually think first about staff hours, but resources include skills, access, tools, and the availability of the people being assessed. Even a perfectly staffed assessment can fail if no one can grant access to the systems, or if the subject matter experts are unavailable for interviews. Resource planning also includes independence and objectivity, because if the assessment team is too close to the system owners, you can end up with soft questions and easy answers. Another resource consideration is training and familiarity, because assessors need to understand the environment well enough to interpret evidence correctly without needing to become operators. The practical takeaway is that resources are not just a budget line. They are the capacity to ask the right questions, see the right things, and document the right proof. A schedule might sound like a simple calendar problem, but in assessments, the schedule is also a risk control. A schedule tells everyone when interviews happen, when evidence is due, when testing windows open, and when drafts and reviews will occur. If you compress the schedule too much, people will rush, and rushed work produces shallow findings that cannot be defended. If you stretch the schedule too far, the environment changes underneath you, and now your evidence is stale before the report is written. The schedule has to account for dependencies, like needing access approvals before testing and needing documentation before interviews can be meaningful. It also needs to account for real life, like change freeze windows, business peak periods, and the fact that the people you need most are often the busiest. A good schedule is realistic, communicated early, and flexible enough to handle issues without collapsing. Deliverables are what the assessment produces, and this matters because people often assume the deliverable is simply a report. In practice, deliverables can include an assessment plan, evidence logs, interview notes summaries, test results, observation details, risk ratings, a draft report, a final report, and sometimes a briefing for leadership. The deliverables should be defined early because they set expectations and prevent the awkward moment where someone says, "I thought you were giving us a full mapping matrix," and the assessor says, "I thought you only needed a summary." Deliverables also determine how the work will be documented, which affects time and effort. A high-level summary might be useful for executives, but the system owners may need detailed findings and evidence references to fix issues. By defining deliverables up front, you make the assessment useful to multiple audiences without turning it into a never-ending writing project. Logistics are the invisible details that, if ignored, create friction and sometimes completely block progress. Logistics include where interviews will happen, whether they are recorded or summarized, what method will be used to collect and store evidence, and how access requests will be handled. Logistics also include communication paths, like who is the primary point of contact, who approves schedule changes, and who resolves disputes about what evidence is acceptable. In many organizations, logistics also cover rules of engagement, such as what testing is allowed, what data can be viewed, and what to do if a critical vulnerability is discovered mid-assessment. Even simple issues like time zones, meeting links, and availability can add up to major delays. When logistics are handled well, the assessment feels professional and calm. When logistics are handled poorly, everyone remembers the assessment as a painful disruption. A very practical part of setting objectives and scope is learning to distinguish between assessing a control and assessing a system outcome, because they are related but not identical. A control assessment focuses on whether the required mechanisms exist and operate, like access reviews, logging, or change management approvals. A system outcome assessment focuses on whether the system is achieving goals like confidentiality, integrity, availability, or compliance with a specific obligation, often by looking at multiple controls working together. If your objective is framed as an outcome, your scope must include the controls that support that outcome, or the assessment becomes opinion-based. If your objective is framed as control compliance, your deliverables should communicate how each control was evaluated and what evidence supports the conclusion. This distinction also helps prevent common misunderstandings, like believing that a single strong tool proves an outcome, or believing that a policy document alone proves a control operates. Clear framing makes the assessment results much more meaningful. Another planning skill that separates mature assessments from messy ones is explicitly stating assumptions and constraints. Assumptions are things you believe to be true while planning, like the system inventory is accurate, access will be granted within a week, or the documentation repository contains current procedures. Constraints are limits you must operate within, like no production testing, limited assessor availability, or a requirement to finish before a governance board meeting. Writing these down is not pessimistic. It is professional because it makes hidden risks visible. If an assumption fails, you can adjust scope or schedule without arguing about whether the plan was reasonable in the first place. If a constraint is too tight, stakeholders can decide to add resources, reduce scope, or accept a limitation in the strength of conclusions. This is also where you learn that transparency in planning is part of defensibility, because later, when findings are questioned, you can show the conditions under which the assessment was performed. Stakeholder alignment is woven through every planning decision because assessments are not performed in a social vacuum. Stakeholders include system owners, security teams, compliance teams, auditors, business leaders, and sometimes vendors, and each group may want something different from the same assessment. One group might want a simple pass or fail statement. Another might want a prioritized remediation list, and another might care most about whether evidence will satisfy an external reviewer. Setting objectives and deliverables is how you negotiate those needs into something coherent. A key misconception is that stakeholder alignment means making everyone happy, but that is not the goal. The goal is shared understanding and documented agreement, so everyone knows what the assessment will and will not do, and what decisions it will support. When stakeholders understand the plan, they are far more likely to cooperate quickly, provide evidence on time, and accept the results even when the results are uncomfortable. It also helps beginners to understand that planning decisions must support rigor, because rigor is what keeps an assessment from turning into a casual conversation. Rigor means consistent methods, clear criteria, and evidence that can be traced to conclusions. When you set objectives, scope, and deliverables, you are also deciding how rigorous the assessment must be based on the risks and the decisions that depend on it. If the assessment supports a major authorization decision, the plan needs deeper evidence collection and tighter documentation practices than a lightweight internal check. Rigor also affects resources, because higher rigor takes more time and more expertise. A realistic assessment plan does not pretend everything can be done at maximum rigor with minimum time. Instead, it matches rigor to purpose, and it documents that match clearly so that decision-makers understand what the assessment can truly support. One simple way to think about all of this is to imagine the assessment as a contract between the assessment team and the stakeholders, even if it is an internal effort. The objectives are what you promise to determine. The scope is what you promise to examine. Resources are what you will use to do it. The schedule is when it will happen. Deliverables are what you will hand over, and logistics are how everyone will work together. If any of those pieces are missing or vague, the contract becomes fuzzy, and fuzzy contracts lead to conflict. When the contract is clear, disagreements become solvable, because people can point to the plan and adjust it deliberately instead of arguing emotionally. This framing also encourages respect for the people being assessed, because they can see what is expected and can prepare evidence without being surprised. For a certification learner, this mindset is especially helpful because it turns assessment planning into a structured governance activity rather than a mysterious security ritual. Before we wrap up, it is worth addressing a final misconception that beginners often carry into governance and assessment work, which is the idea that planning is paperwork that slows down real work. In reality, planning is what makes the real work possible because it reduces wasted effort and prevents avoidable mistakes. A well-planned assessment does not mean you discover fewer issues. It means the issues you do discover are more credible, easier to explain, and easier to act on. It also means the people involved can budget their time and attention, which improves cooperation and reduces stress. The planning phase is where you prevent scope creep, set expectations about evidence, and make sure the assessment team is not improvising under pressure. When you learn to plan assessments well, you are learning to protect the integrity of the entire governance process. By the end of this topic, you should be able to picture an assessment as a carefully defined effort that starts with clear objectives and a realistic scope, supported by the right resources and a schedule that respects both rigor and reality. You should also recognize that deliverables are not an afterthought because they define what value the assessment provides and to whom. Logistics might feel unglamorous, but they are the practical details that keep the work moving and keep evidence secure and usable. When these elements are set thoughtfully and communicated clearly, the assessment becomes defensible, repeatable, and genuinely helpful rather than disruptive. That is the kind of assessment planning that supports good governance and strong risk decisions, and it is exactly the mindset you want to carry forward as you continue through CGRC content.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.